It can seem from where we sit here in Canada that the rights of LGBTQ people have come a long, long way. It is still far from true, however, in many parts of the world. The small East Asian nation of Brunei, for example, just made same-sex relationships punishable by death. Neela Ghoshal is senior researcher in the LGBT rights program at Human Rights Watch, and she joins us now for more. Hi, Neela.
Hi.
It's nice to have you here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
First, before we start talking, let's first learn a little bit about Brunei. Brunei is a small nation surrounded by Malaysia and the South China Sea. It has a population of just 430,000, but immense oil wealth, which has made the Sultan, who's been ruling since 1967, one of the wealthiest people on earth. Brunei's new penal code went into effect on April 3rd. To what extent does it target LGBTQ people?
Well, the penal code targets a number of people. It targets anybody who's involved in having sex with someone of the same sex. It also targets couples who are having extramarital sex, so this could be couples of different sexes who are not married. It targets a whole number of groups. And
what does it stipulate?
It stipulates, probably the harshest provision in this penal code is death by stoning as the punishment for anal sex, as well as the punishment for extramarital sex. So in cases in which people are caught and accused of having extramarital sex or anal sex, death by stoning, 100 lashes with a whip is another punishment. Lesbian sex is punishable by 40 lashes with a whip. The punishments are really shockingly horrific to hear about in 2019.
Do you know why it's different for same-sex relations between men and versus women?
Well, interestingly, most penal codes around the world that criminalize same-sex relations are harder than on men than they are on women. Mm-hmm. And we can speculate a number of things. I mean, it may be that same-sex relations between men are treated as more real sex, which offends people's sense of what sexuality is supposed to be like, whereas sex between women is not really understood very well. It's often seen in many cultures as women just playing around, girls just experimenting. But in the case of Brunei, 40 lashes for women playing around is a pretty serious penalty as well.
And the population for Brunei, it's 2/3 of the people are Muslim.
That's right.
So this would affect people who aren't even Muslim. It's everybody that lives there.
The law affects both Muslims and non-Muslims. It depends on the provision of the Sharia penal code. So for instance, the provision on lesbian sex only applies to people who are Muslims, whereas the provision on anal sex between men or between men and women applies to both Muslims and non-Muslims.
Brunei had originally planned to bring in this law in either 2014 or 2015, right?
Right.
Why didn't they at the time?
So Brunei did bring in some aspects of this law in 2014. So when the penal code was first passed, the government explained that they were going to roll it out in 3 phases, and they were going to start with the less harsh punishments. So there are a number of other provisions within this law. There are laws that ban the sale of alcohol, for instance. There are laws that ban certain forms of speech about Islam, other things that people might say that run contrary to Islam. And initially, the government said, we are just rolling out the laws that are punishable by fines or imprisonment. So essentially, the lighter penalties. And they said phase 2 was going to happen 1 year later, and that was going to involve the laws that were punishable by whipping or by amputation. This law also calls for amputation.
For like theft? Or...
As a punishment for theft, yeah. And then finally, in the 3rd phase, another year later, they were going to roll out the death penalty. And at the time in 2014, Brunei faced so much international condemnation for the harshness and the extremity of these provisions that the government essentially stepped back. They never gave an explanation as to whether they were going to continue implementation of the law or not, but all we saw was that first phase, and the government went quiet. And then suddenly, at the end of last year, an announcement appeared on the Attorney General's website that the remainder of the law would be implemented starting on April 3rd.
Is there anything else happening that would make it happen now? Because it's really interesting, like, why now?
Well, there's a lot of speculation. I mean, one theory is that the government of Brunei was just waiting for the furor to calm down, that they wanted to see how they could do this more quietly and escape international condemnation. They may have thought that they would find a way to avoid drawing international attention to it. And another theory is that the economy of Brunei has been in some decline. It's still an extraordinarily wealthy country, but people are a bit frustrated with economic mismanagement by this government. And we often find around the world that when governments are being accused by their populace of not managing the economy well, the government tries to distract people. So this is a way to pull out a sort of tool that is popular among much of the population and say, well, we're addressing this other issue.
Can you give us, because it is affecting this particular group, can you give us a sense of what it's like to be an LGBTQ person in Brunei right now?
Well, it's extremely difficult. And it's so difficult to be LGBTQ in Brunei that it's very difficult to find LGBTQ people to talk to. So we can only say that we've spoken to a few people there, not to a large sample of the population.
Because I'm thinking people will be too scared to even talk to.
People are terrified, and people are not organized, they're not united. In much of the world, even in countries that have fairly harsh laws, there is a strong civil society movement arising whereby LGBT people are getting together and demanding their rights. So far, there's none of that in Brunei, and that has to do, I think, with a combination of the harshness of the laws. Even the existing laws already punished gay sex by up to 10 years in prison, as well as the extreme social stigma around same-sex sexuality. So the few people that we have talked to say that they feel extremely isolated, they feel alone, they have no support, they are very anxious, they're sleepless. I was communicating with someone who was messaging me at 3 in the morning because he couldn't sleep at night, the night that this law was being implemented. They don't know what's going to happen to them.
Let's look beyond Brunei. Brunei became the 7th country in the world to make homosexuality punishable by death. And according to Human Rights Watch, there are at least 69 countries in the world that have criminalized same-sex relations. How would you characterize the state of LGBTQ rights around the world in 2019?
Well, in general, things are going in the right direction. So a few years ago, there were 76 countries that criminalized homosexual relations. And to go down from 76 to 69 in a matter of, I think, the last 5 years is pretty impressive. There are movements, as I said, in many countries in the world that are arguing for their rights and that often are going to court. So, for instance, we saw in India last year a tremendous victory for the LGBT community with the Supreme Court striking down the sodomy laws there. We've also seen...
Because it was against the law to be gay?
It was against the law to engage in what was defined as carnal knowledge against the order of nature in the Indian Penal Code. This was essentially a colonial relic. At the time of British colonialism, Britain imposed laws on almost all of its colonies that prohibited so-called unnatural sex or unnatural offenses. And domino by domino, those laws have been falling. Some countries have been reforming their penal codes. Angola did so this year, just in January, and finally got rid of its colonial era law, inherited from the Portuguese. Other countries like Kenya and Botswana have cases in the courts right now in which activists are arguing that these laws are a violation of their constitutional rights. So there's a lot going on. There are also transgender movements in many parts of the world in which people are arguing that they have the right to be recognized by the gender identity which fits them. And they're arguing for policies to be brought in place so that they can change their documents and so that they are not constrained by a gender identity that doesn't belong to them.
But at the same time, in the U.S., the president hasn't, they've announced that if you're trans, you can't be in the military.
Of course, the U.S. is one of several countries that is going in the wrong direction right now. And of course, that has to do with politics and the particular politics of this administration in the U.S., which are, taking things backwards on rights on so many levels. But overall, around the world on LGBT rights, I think we can say that there's progress. However, I think that progress has also produced a sort of backlash in which other governments are seeing that LGBT movements are standing up and speaking out and are saying, no, we don't want that here. Let's not let things get to that point here. So let's put in harsher laws in place to constrain communities further before they get to the point that they feel that they can safely organize, speak out, say anything about their constitutional rights. Let's make sure that the idea of constitutional rights isn't even on the table.
I want to go back to India for a second. That law that was struck down, it was a Supreme Court decision made by 5 people. To what extent does this decision represent a cultural shift within India?
I think it represents a huge cultural shift. In India, the movement it's really found its voice in the last several decades. And so, 20 years ago, it was very hard hard to find people in India who were openly gay, who would speak out and say that they were gay. Even 10 years ago, this case has spent a long time in the Indian courts being batted back and forth, a ruling going one way, an appeals court ruling going another way. And when the case first came to the courts more than 10 years ago, it was very hard to get petitioners who were openly gay. So the case was initially brought by a non-governmental organization that worked on HIV prevention, saying these laws are hurting men who have sex with men who are, HIV positive or at risk of contracting HIV. This time around, in 2018, when the case went before the Supreme Court, there were a number of people who came forward and said, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm transgender, and this is how this law
So people felt like they could speak up.
me.
Let's move to the Middle East. We only have a few minutes left. I want to show you a clip from Shireen El-Feki from the Agenda back in 2013. She's the author of Sex in the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. Sheldon, could you please roll?
If we're looking specifically at Egypt, the trends towards narrow conservative interpretations of Islam across the board in all areas of life, but in particular in the role of women and around sexuality, have been gaining ground for decades. It's been under the table. Now, after the overthrow of the Mubarak regime, it's now on the table. And what is fascinating is that you see people challenging it at every level. If we look back over the past few months since the election of President Morsi, we have seen nonstop protests, civil disobedience, strikes, lawsuits, you name it. People are finding their voice. And as I said, it was very hard to challenge these austere interpretations of Islam for as long as they were happening underground, if you like, in resistance to a dictatorship. Now that they're out in the open, people are asking very hard questions of politics that they never dared to do before.
This was back in 2013, and she had hope for change in Egypt after the uprisings. Has that change happened?
I think that clip demonstrates that progress is not necessarily linear. There was change that was happening. There was a movement that was galvanized. That movement is still there to some extent, an LGBT movement, a strong women's movement in Egypt. But the LGBT movement has had to go largely underground because once al-Sisi came into power, things turned on their head again. And al-Sisi began very aggressively persecuting and prosecuting people for same-sex conduct. We've had hundreds of people thrown in jail in Egypt in the last couple of years simply for being suspected of being gay. The police are actively tracking people. Police are getting on websites and entrapping people pretending to be gay, meeting them at coffee shops, and then arresting them. They're subjected to forced anal examinations, which is an incredibly barbaric way and totally unscientific of attempting to verify whether someone has had anal sex or not. So Egypt is, again, one of the countries that is absolutely going in the wrong direction on this. On the other hand, there was a movement that was awakened. The activists in Egypt are still networked to other activists in the Middle East, trying to work together on regional solutions and ways forward.
The connection that is often made is this: the more secular and less religious a country becomes, the greater the expansion of LGBTQ rights. Is there a connection?
Well, I think that's probably a generalization that doesn't always hold true. And you can look at Latin America, for example. Latin America is a region that is strongly religious, heavily Catholic, also with strong evangelical movements right now, but where there has been tremendous progress on LGBT rights. So a number of countries that were among the first to pioneer marriage equality have been in Latin America. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has put forward an advisory opinion arguing that transgender people have the right to gender recognition, that marriage equality is also a right under the Inter-American Charter, and many countries in Latin America are moving forward on this. So I think we can see many examples of countries in which people are able to sort of compartmentalize their personal religious beliefs from a broader understanding of basic human rights for all. Unfortunately, in other countries, religion is politicized and weaponized as a tool to keep LGBT people oppressed.
I want to talk about Uganda. The last time that I was in Uganda was 2008, 2009. And at the time, the government wanted to make being gay punishable by death. And if you or knew of a family member or a friend who was gay and you didn't turn them into the police, you could actually be thrown in prison yourself. What's the situation like in Uganda right now?
Well, the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda did pass in 2014. It had been slightly reformed to the extent that it no longer had the death penalty in place because there had been such strong political pressure on Uganda against this law. But Uganda did still pass a law that included a life sentence in prison, which, by the way, was already on the books for same-sex conduct, and that also prohibited all forms of LGBT organizing and expression. That law was struck down by the courts 6 months later on a technicality. However, it had done its damage. We documented a number of cases of Ugandans who were fired from their jobs, kicked out of their homes, arrested, particularly trans people, stripped, paraded naked before the police.
There was also, they printed people's names. They outed a lot of people in a tabloid.
They did.
Yeah.
They did. They published people's names. And so a lot of Ugandans fled the country. Others went underground. On the other hand, the court did have the independence to stand up and strike down the law. So that law is not in effect. However, the penal code that existed before that law does still punish same-sex conduct with up to life in prison. The good thing about Uganda is that there are some tremendous activists there who have been really courageous in the face of tremendous social pressure and possible legal sanctions, and really are putting their lives on the line to fight against the implementation of the law that is already on the books and to fight against broader social stigma in Uganda.
Because we've talked about a couple of countries where some of the local movements have been suppressed by the government. In your view, do you think that it's the work of the people on the ground that will move things forward, or do you think that it's the reaction of the international community putting pressure on various governments?
I think most change is going to come from within. It's people within movements in their countries who can stand up and say, here's how I'm affected by these laws, here's who I am, and here's why my basic rights need to be respected. And Kenya is a country in which, I'm seeing this really powerfully, where there's a huge number of activists now who are out, who are public, who are demanding equality. On the other hand, international pressure can often be a very important tool to help support those activists, but it has to come from dialogue with the activists on the ground, understanding what they want, not getting into a situation in which international pressure can be interpreted or politically manipulated as the West having a gay agenda that it's trying to impose on various countries, which is how governments try to spin it. So I think for groups like ours, for Human Rights Watch, it's very important to work closely in collaboration with grassroots activists to elevate their voices and to make sure that we're doing what we can to help them be heard.
And in those countries that we've talked about, and in places like the Middle East, I think some people might want to say, the Middle East is like North America was in the 50s when it comes to LGBTQ rights. Is that a helpful way of looking at it?
Every country and every region has its own trajectory, and I don't think that that's necessarily a helpful way of looking at it. There were some countries in the Middle East that were more liberal in the 1950s than they are now, and that's politics. So I do think it's helpful in countries where same-sex sexuality is criminalized or stigmatized to look to other countries where there has been progress and to try to learn from that progress, but not to kind of copy and paste strategies. Different things are going to work in different places. In the Middle East, a lot of people that we talk to say, look, people are uncomfortable talking about sexuality in general, not just same-sex conduct. And so we have to figure out a way to work within that culture and figure out arguments that will make sense with our people to advance our rights.
President Obama was fond of the Dr. Martin Luther King quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Despite examples like Brunei, do you see that arc taking place for LGBTQ rights around the world in 2019?
I do see that arc taking place. I think that there has been tremendous progress around the world. I think that it's natural that when there's progress, there will be steps backward as well. But I think you have a huge number of people around the world now for whom, young people growing up, for whom it's normal to see and know and accept people who are LGBTQ. And that's certainly happening in Africa, where I've spent a lot of my time. That's also happening to some extent in the Middle East. And the more people recognize that LGBTQ people are regular people, are not a threat to the social order, the more it's pretty easy to just accept people's private lives and move on.
Neela, thank you so much for being here and helping us understand what's going on. I'm sure the world's going to be watching to see what happens next in Brunei.
I hope they are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was Neela Ghoshal, Senior Researcher in the LGBT Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.